So we're going to talk for a few minutes about the ventricular system. This is a model of the ventricular system. Remember that the brain ventricles are basically spaces inside the brain that contain cerebral spinal fluid. And these spaces are interconnected by openings or foramina so that there's flow of cerebral spinal fluid throughout the brain. We're looking at the lateral aspect of this model of the ventricular system. So this is the lateral ventricle. It has a C shape with sort of a tail on the end. This is the lateral horn of the lateral ventricle, the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, and the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. The area where these three horns come together is called the trigone of the lateral ventricle. There are two lateral ventricles, so if we turn this model so that the lateral ventricles are uppermost, and this is the anatomical position, we can see that there are two lateral ventricles, and they are joined together by an opening foramina called the foramen of Monroe, and there's one for each lateral ventricle that opens from the lateral ventricle into the third ventricle. We can see the superior surface of the third ventricle here. If we turn the model back on its side, we can see the space. This is the third ventricle. So remember, with these models, they're cast models, so the plastic actually fills up the cavity. So this plastic is filling up what would be the cavity of the third ventricle. Now remember that the third ventricle is in the space between the two thalami, so that interthalamic adhesion, or the massa intermedia that joins the thalamus from one side to the thalamus from the other, would be right here where this hole is, because there would be no space where that interthalamic adhesion is located. So third ventricle here, this marks the massa intermedia, or the interthalamic adhesion. Now the third ventricle is joined to the fourth ventricle by this long tubular structure called the cerebral aqueduct. And remember that the cerebral aqueduct runs through the brainstem, runs through the midbrain, and carries cerebral spinal fluid from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is located between the cerebellum and the pons, and has three foramina that carry cerebral spinal fluid out of the fourth ventricle to surround the brain in the subarachnoid space, and also to carry cerebral spinal fluid down into the spinal canal. There's one more little opening. So if we turn the ventricular system over so that you can see the two lateral openings of the fourth ventricle, here and here, these are the foramina of Luschka, these lateral openings. And remember that we know that because lateral and Luschka both start with an L. And then we have an opening in the midline called the foramen of Magendie here. And then there's another opening that carries cerebral spinal fluid down to the spinal canal, and that is the opening into the spinal canal. So those openings all come out of the fourth ventricle. So to recap, we have a lateral ventricle, third ventricle here, cerebral aqueduct, and fourth ventricle.